Do we really know what happened? The brother did it.
The brother. That's what I thought too.
I mean, that seems like kind of obvious. We're both into like true crimes.
Deathy murdery thing.
Yeah. Maybe that should be the title.
Deathy murdery thing.
Could be that. Could be something not that, because that sucks.
That's gonna be our theme song. It'll be just a silent recording of me going, hey.
You done with your Oreo?
Yeah. I'm almost done with my Oreo.
Okay, good.
Welcome to
Murdery thingy.
Murdery mystery thingy.
Murdery mystery thingy. I know the name of it.
I think.
I'm Mario.
I'm Chloe.
And this is Mystery Murdery Thingy.
Or Murdery Mystery Thingy. Or Murdery Mystery Thingy. Because I'm going to be honest when I say, I really don't remember.
Pretty sure it's...
Isn't that sad?
Mystery Murdery Thingy.
Okay.
Pretty sure.
I mean, so... What are you doing? Is it a mystery, a murdery, or a thingy?
Mine is definitely a mystery. Or kind of a thingy mystery, maybe.
Okay.
I wanted to take a bit of a break from the murder and assassination and gore that I've been dealing with the past couple of times. So mine is most decidedly not murdery. No one dies, although there will be some injuries along the way, so we'll get to that.
That's so funny because mine is super gory, and it is a murder mystery.
Great. So you'll go first.
Cool.
And then we'll talk about weird shit in the news.
Whoa. Excuse me. So, okay. Let's start. So, I am focusing on Germany's most famous unsolved crime, the Hinterkaifeck killings. I think that's how you say it.
Sounds right.
Yeah. So, the murders happened in Bavaria, Germany in 1922 on a small homestead located a half a mile behind, or Hinter, the town of Kaifeck. It was the home of Victoria Gabriel and her two kids, Cecilia, who was 7, and Joseph, I'm not sure. Is Joseph like Sweden? That's like Swedish, right?
I think they say Josef in Germany as well.
Okay, I'll say Joseph, who was 2. And Victoria's elderly parents lived there as well. Andreas, and also the grandmother's name is also Cecilia. Andreas and Cecilia Gruber. So, on April 4th, neighbors began to investigate once the family hadn't been seen in school or at church for the past 3 days. So, they started a search party, and they found 4 brutally mutilated bodies in the barn and 2 more in the house. The 4 in the barn were Victoria, her parents, and the younger Cecilia. 2-year-old Josef and their maid, who it was her first day on the job.
Oh my God.
Yeah. They were found dead in the house. So, like I said, this is pretty brutal.
So it's a total of 6 people killed.
6, yes. The elder Cecilia showed signs of strangulation and had blows to the head, which left her with a cracked skull. Her husband, Andreas, was covered in blood, and his cheekbones could be seen protruding from the flesh. Victoria's skull was also smashed, and the right side of her face showed 9 star-shaped wounds, indicating she was hit with a blunt object. And the younger Cecilia, her lower jaw had been shattered, and she had large wounds on her neck and her face. So, the autopsy found that they were killed with a mattock. Mattock? It is a pickaxe-looking thing.
Oh, okay.
Nice, right?
Right.
The most chilling is that Cecilia likely remained alive for several hours and in shock because there was evidence that she had pulled out her own hair. It was in clumps.
Wow,
yeah.
Quite gruesome.
Yeah. The maid Maria and Joseph were found inside. They were also brutally murdered. She was killed by crosswise blows to the head in her room, and Joseph was in his bed in his mother's room, and his skull was found to be cracked as well. He had blunt force trauma to the face. it was said that the family had been systematically lured to the barn one by one and killed with the pickaxe. The bodies in the barn had been stacked on top of each other and covered in hay. Maria and Josef's bodies in the house were covered with sheets. Their farm animals and their Pomeranian watchdog were unharmed, but what's weird and also about this, there's a lot of weird stuff about this, is that they were taken care of and fed for several days after the family had been killed. There was evidence that the killer had been there for days, eating meals and lighting fires in the hearth.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is creepy.
There were a series of odd things that happened, like leading up to these killings. So when the police questioned the former maid, the one before Maria, she thought that the property was haunted. And so the cops asked her about this. And she said that she had come to the conclusion, after constantly hearing sounds in the attic and experiencing an unsettling feeling of being watched. Yeah. Andreas had also confided in neighbors about some other weird things that happened days before that they were killed. A newspaper that he did not buy was found in his home. A set of footsteps were discovered leading from the forest to the farmstead, and the footsteps were they were in the unmarked snow, and they were only leading in one direction. And nobody knew who they belonged to.
Mm-hmm.
To make matters even stranger, one of the family's 2 keys disappeared shortly before the murder as well, and it's possible that the days leading up to the killing, someone had been sneaking around the homestead, like planning things and like in the house and shit.
That's
like,
what it sounds like. Like
yeah.
he was casing the place.
Yeah, like they...
Which, of course, we've heard about the Spider-Man and...
that was creepy.
Was it Ted Bundy who used to do that? Like hang out in people's houses leading up to the crime itself?
I think so. I know...
Some famous serial killer did that as well.
My main man, the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez.
That's who I was thinking of, Richard
He tried
Ramirez.
doors and shit.
Right.
Which is so scary.
Yeah.
He would just walk around and wiggle door handles, and if it was open, he'd walk in.
Exactly.
Lock your doors, people.
Right.
So, yeah, and so that also is kind of funny because the maid was like, I was always hearing things. So that could also be kind of related to that, but I mean, we don't really know. Okay, so in the initial investigation, police looked at transients and vagrants as possible suspects because they're always passing by the homestead. But they really never got any evidence for that. Nothing came up. And there was also, this is another one of the weird things. There was some weird family stuff going on. And so the police then looked at several men that were involved in the family. And so this kind of goes with the theories that were there. So Victoria was a widow. Her husband died in World War I, and she was in a relationship with a man named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who also led... He was also the one that led the search party. So Victoria and Lorenz had plans to get married, but her father Andreas interfered, and Lorenz then eventually married somebody else. According to others in the watch party, Lorenz knew his way around the farm really well, and he seemed nonchalant and unfazed when the bodies were found, but the police failed to place him at the crime scene. Like, there wasn't any evidence for him being there, and it didn't make sense. So there was a lack of evidence, and they also said that his behavior could be due to the just initial shock of what happened, and he also knew his way around the farm because he was in a relationship with Victoria, so he was there. So to this day, cops don't know who the killer is, and the case has been reopened several times in the last 95 years, and the most recent one was in 2007, where police used new investigation techniques to look into the murders. And I mean, this happened before. Like, once DNA came out, people started going back to cases all the time.
Right.
Sometimes they were solved, sometimes they weren't, and this one wasn't.
There are multiple TV shows that are built around that premise,
For
right?
sure.
Cold case files, forensic files, et cetera, et cetera.
The thing is that since it was so long ago, a lot of the evidence was gone, and it was also before World War II. So a lot of it was lost in the upheaval of that.
Right.
And people were looking all over the farm, so possible evidence could have been trampled and not taken care of there. So that's one of the reasons why it's so hard to solve, and it probably will never be solved. But the police landed on a theory, but they kept it a secret. Nobody knows what it is. And they did that out of respect for the remaining family members, even though to me that doesn't make any sense. Because I feel like you would want closure, but maybe they came to a theory that was like...
Implicated a family member, you're saying?
Yeah. Actually, I have more. Okay. So here are some theories. Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, came back from the war and killed them all. But it was found that he had been killed in France a decade earlier, and many soldiers attested to seeing his body.
Okay.
And some say Victoria...
Pretty good alibi.
Yeah.
Being dead.
Yeah.
Pretty good.
He just wasn't there.
Right.
Some say Victoria and Andreas killed the family before turning the weapons on themselves. So here's the thing. Both Andreas and Victoria have been accused of incest, and Victoria even went to jail for a couple months back in 1915. So Andreas had incestuous attitudes, and he was abusive. So, also apparently Victoria had siblings, but she was the only one that survived to adulthood.
Do they know what happened to the other ones, or it's...
No.
Ooh.
Yeah. But there wasn't evidence that this has been a murder-suicide, like that autopsy didn't reveal that type of thing. And also pickaxe.
Right.
So the only certainties are that it was someone who didn't live on the farm but had knowledge of the homestead. And the main thought is that it was someone who had some sort of vendetta against the family because there was all this other crap going on with them. Also, fun fact, the skulls were given to clairvoyants. So some people who thought they were psychic and could figure out something from the skulls and this, that, and the other thing. They wanted to find... Apparently it was to find more about the killer or the victims.
Okay, so they held some, like, seances with them and things of that nature.
I guess. But the skulls were kept in Munich, inexplicably, for some reason. And the family and their maid were buried without their heads. Yeah. And the skulls were, like I said, they were lost during World War II. And they're lost to this day. They've never been recovered.
Ooh, that's creepy.
Right? I'm done. Is that bad?
No. I mean, it's whatever you have. We're at 13 minutes right now. So if you have any more, you've got plenty of time.
My sources were...
Well, okay, so just tell me, what do you think actually happened? After having looked at all this, what's your best guess as to what is the real thing?
I think it was either Lorenz who did it or an outside intruder. It could have been a transient person. And I don't think it's a coincidence that they had all this, like, other stuff. I don't really know. I wish...
Yeah, it's hard to tell, really, just from the way that they did the investigation was so kind of ham-handed that it's difficult to really know the facts. But I think we know now most people are killed by close family members. Like, just from a statistical standpoint, murders tend to occur between people who know each other very well. So I think that's kind of the baseline in some respects. And to me, the fact that they continue to take care of the farm animals suggests that it was someone who lived there or was a part of the family or at least had some strong connection to those animals, because it just seems so strange that a serial killer who's some transient who's just going around doing these things would have taken that time to care for the animals as well. It just seems like very, very strange.
Maybe it was the previous maid.
It could have been, right? And then she talks about this ghost and all these things, you know, to try to move them off the trail or
But I really do believe somebody was, like, in there, in the house with them.
That's definitely what it sounds like.
And Lorenz, maybe he hired somebody. Because I also read that, Victoria's father, Andreas, didn't approve of them.
Right.
So they ended up separating, and then Lorenz ended up marrying somebody else.
Right.
And they had a baby, but the baby died 2 weeks earlier.
Oh.
And it's also stated that Josef, the 2-year-old, the youngest, they don't really know who the father is, and most people say it's probably Lorenz.
Right.
That he's the father. And so, you know, that's unacceptable according to Andreas.
So
it's kind of weird because they're not married.
Right. So there's kind of a plausible scenario where Andreas, who didn't approve of their relationship and also was probably jealous of him because of this weird incestual connection.
Right.
You know, finds out this is their kid, or maybe it's just been stewing within him for so long.
Yeah.
And then it comes out in this, you know, fit of rage, and then this, you know, kind of murder-suicide scenario plays out.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty plausible.
I don't know about the murder-suicide, though.
Just because the evidence from the autopsy doesn't really support it.
Yeah, and I feel like suicide by pickaxe.
That's true.
You know.
That's true. Not really plausible. No, I agree.
Like, everybody had blunt force trauma, cracked skulls, severe injuries that showed this was somebody who knew them. It was intimate. It was angry.
Well, that's the other thing too, right? If you look at you know, the FBI, you know, psychological profiles, those types of murders where it's, you know, up close, blunt force trauma, that does tend to, I think, give credence to the fact that it was someone who knew them, who had a relationship with them. It seems as though it was kind of a crime of passion.
Yes, for sure. The person killed everybody. Everybody was six people, including a 2-year-old.
Including a 2-year-old child.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, I mean, this is an
innocent maid.
Right.
So it was like no onlookers, no survivors, no witnesses type thing.
Exactly. Which means we'll never really know what happened.
Because everybody's dead.
Right.
Everybody's dead. Everybody's dead. Everybody's dead.
That's a sad song.
What if we're all dead?
What if we're all the dream of a butterfly?
What?
It's an old Chinese proverb.
I read this was like on Tumblr or something, and somebody was like, what if we're just like some alien C+ science project? And I was like, whoa, dude.
Could be.
That's so weird. I don't want to talk about that.
Okay. Well,
Your turn.
Right.
Your turn.
Well, I'm gonna talk about the phenomenon of cargo cults.
Phenomena. Do 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 do. Phenomena. Do do. Sorry.
That's okay. You're very singy today.
Thank you.
Yeah. You have a very positive attitude, even after having talked about the grisly murder of 6 family members. Or 5 family members and a maid, I guess.
What does that say about me? I'm it's because it's something that I'm very disconnected from it. It might as well be a fictional story that I read in a thriller book.
Sure.
You know? That's how crazy it is.
And it happened like 100 years ago.
It happened in 1922, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So anyway, to get away from the murder temporarily.
Now onto something happy.
Now onto something pretty interesting, and yeah. So the term cargo cults refers to kind of a various sets of religious beliefs, and it started as kind of a pejorative term, mainly from like Australian farmers who were referring to this phenomenon of people in the islands of Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia, basically the area west of Australia, right? Papua New Guinea, and then toward Hawaii and the western coast of the United States, that when these native peoples had contact with European settlers, beginning with the arrival of Captain James Cook in 1774 to some of these islands, they basically couldn't conceptualize of how these people got all the stuff that they brought with them. And that's the cargo that the cargo cults are based on. So in their attempt to explain how this could possibly happen, they basically created a set of religious beliefs that we've come to call cargo cults.
Cool.
And the sort of main aspects of it, of what defines a cargo cult, are that it involves a sort of millenarian or eschatological return to traditional practices.
What?
So basically, it's similar to like doomsday cults, which are popular all around the world, right? You see this, like, there's a specific Christian radio host who's actually been predicting the end of the world for several decades now. And you see people who will give up all their worldly possessions, quit their jobs.
Like Om Shinrikyo.
Like Om Shinrikyo.
That was his whole thing.
But it also comes up in this context of these mainly Melanesian islands. But I think it's interesting to note that it's that sort of eschatological, end of times belief is something that recurs kind of all over the world. But in addition to that, there's a kind of cultural and natural inversion that is also part of this belief. So the coming of these white settlers, kind of along with later Christian missionaries who taught them about, the Christian concept of, the end of times and the coming of Jesus and how that's going to bring a new era of, wealth and prosperity and heaven on earth, that kind of melded with the traditional beliefs and practices that they already had.
Oh, okay.
And those types of cults tended to also have that aspect where they would kind of purge everything that they had, because they believed that in doing that they would fulfill this kind of belief that the end of times was coming. So they need to give up the trappings of their previous life in anticipation of the new kind of heaven on earth.
So did they look at these men who came with all this stuff as like gods?
It differs depending on the particular, one that you're talking about, but some of them did, and some of them thought that they were coming from, like, the land of the dead.
Whoa.
And that the material wealth that they brought with them, since they couldn't kind of conceive of, modern practices in terms of, factories and, all these things, that these objects must have been created by the gods or by the spirits or by their ancestors, and they were brought from the land of the dead. And in some of these cargo cults, they believed that the white settlers were actually taking those things that were meant for the native peoples. So in other words, in their conception, their ancestors were trying to give them all this material wealth, but it was being kind of stolen by the white settlers. And this gets into another common feature of these cargo cults, that they tend to reinforce a belief that the white settlers and the missionaries and all of those people need to be their practices need to be gotten rid of, and there needs to be a return to the traditional practices, which they call custom. And it gets coupled, with this idea of kind of insurrection or, a return to traditional life and traditional practices. But it's kind of paradoxical because it also is coupled with this belief that they're going to be given all this material wealth from these same people. So it's kind of interesting in that way that it's sort of forward-looking to having all of this modern convenience and modern objects, but also backward-looking in that it represents a return to the traditional practices before, the white men came in the 18th century, and then through the 20th century with the missionaries, and finally with the American army and various armies that came to their islands.
So it kind of sounds like these people came, they have no idea who they are and no idea what all the stuff is that they have, and they needed to explain it.
Exactly, which is
the basis of all religion.
Exactly. It's one of the bases of religion. It's a way in which to explain phenomenon for which there is no rational explanation.
For sure.
And from these people's perspectives, that's the most rational explanation, that since these things couldn't have been created by any natural means, they must be created by some sort of spiritual means. And then everything kind of gets slotted into that. Now, what this led to in some of these islands was a ritualistic practice or set of practices where they would create, fake airstrips, fake wharfs. They would create buildings in which they would have literally coconut halves that they would put on their ears and pretend that they were radios, because they believed that by doing that, they would cause the gods to bring them this material wealth that had left when the army left at the end of World War II, basically. Now, of course, that didn't happen. It didn't really work in a sense. So most of those cargo cults went away after several years. But the one that I'm going to focus on, which is the cult of John Frum, has persisted all the way to literally today.
Okay, go.
So the central mystery, I think, of what I'm going to talk about is this figure, John Frum, and whether he really existed or whether he was just kind of purely a fictional concept that was created by the natives, or whether he was a hallucination that they then used for these kind of purposes.
Wait, so we don't even know if he was real?
It's not clear whether he was real or not at all.
How's that possible?
Because it's never been really proven one way or the other. Like
Jesus?
Yeah, in a similar way. Was Jesus a single person? Was Jesus a set of, people who were then kind of conflated in the scriptures? The name Jesus Christ itself is kind of a symbol name that refers to this kind of, return or eschatological belief in the end of times. John Frum is kind of similar in that way. His name, the last name Frum, there's different ideas of where that came from. Some people think that when the native peoples were introduced to the Americans, they said, I'm Tom from Cincinnati, or I'm John from Atlanta. And they kind of misconstrued that to think that they were all called, John Frum. There's also...
That's so funny.
Right. There's also an idea that it may have been... he may have been called John Frum because in the native Pidgin English, Frum is the word that they use for broom or sweep. So John Frum is this figure who's going to sweep away the excesses and the non-traditional beliefs that were brought by the white people, by the missionaries, by the army. And he's going to harbinge this return to traditional practices. And that's really where the John Frum cult kind of originated. And I'm going to read a quote from one of the local chiefs. He's being quoted by a person who went there in the I believe it was the early 2000s, and he tells this story. So this is a quote from a story by Paul Raffel in Smithsonian Magazine. Quote, Chief Isaac and other local leaders say that John Frum first appeared one night in the late 1930s after a group of elders had downed many shells of kava, which, just an aside, is kind of mild narcotic drug that may have some kind of hallucinogenic properties as well, perhaps.
Nice.
Right, so to get back to the quote, downed many shells of kava as a prelude to receiving messages from the spirit world. This is Chief Isaac speaking. He was a white man who spoke our language, but he didn't tell us that he was an American, says Chief Kahuya, leader of Yakul village. John Frum told them he had come to rescue them from the missionaries and colonial officials. John told us that all Tana's people should stop following the white man's ways, Chief Kahuya says. He said we should throw away their money and clothes, take our children from their schools, stop going to church, and go back to living as Kastom people. We should drink kava, worship the magic stones, and perform our ritual dances. So this is the story that they tell, that this was, a white man who spoke their language, who told them, basically gave them this set of beliefs that, I'm an American, but you shouldn't follow what the other missionaries and Americans are telling you. You should return to your traditional practices. And he promised them that if they listened to him, they followed his teachings, and they waited for his return, that he would bring all of this material wealth back to them. And I was reading a really interesting paper by an anthropologist who was theorizing that this basically maps onto the local culture, which is very much based on gift giving. So in other words, if I'm a powerful person in their society, I'll give you, 5 pigs, and that proves that I'm a wealthy, important, powerful person. Okay. So the more you can give, the more power you have in their society.
I wish we were like that.
Right, exactly. And then there are, there are cultures definitely who are modern who think in a very similar way. I think Japanese culture, Mexican culture.
I was just about to say that.
Exactly. So again, there's interesting features of this that I think you can see in other cultures as well. But the theory is that when the Americans and the missionaries and everybody came with all of this inexplicable material wealth, that it created a sense in the local people that they had been denigrated, that by being given all of these things, they were appreciative of that and they were interested, but it also meant that they were then lower in their own eyes because they couldn't return those gifts.
Okay.
So this John Frum character, I think, also represents the kind of perfect strong man in their conception. But they set it up as a strong man who's going to help them to further their own traditional practices. So again, it gets to this interesting paradox of, a melding of Western culture with their own culture, but also a return to their own traditional practices as opposed to the, Christianity and the Western practices. And for them, John Frum really became a symbol of that resistance to the white colonialists. And one of those, and this is where we were talking about the broom idea, was from an island administrator called Alexander Runtoul, who made that note that Frum also means broom, so it's kind of this kind of sweeping away of the colonialist rule. And this didn't go unnoticed by the people who were there at the time. So in the 1940s, the leaders of the early John Frum movement were actually imprisoned, and they were labeled as martyrs.
So where was this mainly? Where did this take place?
This mainly took place on the islands of what's now called Vanuatu, which was known at the time as New Caledonia. And this is basically a set of about 80 islands that are located, probably several hundred to 1,000 miles off the western coast of Australia.
Okay.
And they're pretty small islands. And the one place where this has most taken root and is still present today, I watched a really interesting YouTube video where they were showing the some of these practices, is on the island of Tana. And it's an island that's about 23 miles by about 16 miles, so it's pretty small. And there's about 35,000 people that live there. Mm-hmm. And actually within that island itself, it's really interesting because there was a kind of religious schism. So even within the John Frum cargo cults, there are two different sects, even just on that small island.
That's so weird.
Right.
I mean, it's like that with a lot of religions.
Well, I was going to say, and that's kind of, I think, what keeps coming up with this is it mirrors a lot of the aspects of Western religions as well. And it's an interesting kind of lens, I think, through which you can see how the development of religion itself has these common features. And I think that's because we're all human and we all kind of need to answer the same questions and tend to come to some of the same kinds of answers, based on our circumstances. But, and this is where I was talking about, there were some people who got hurt in this.
How so?
So there was this religious schism where this man named Prophet Fred, and this was in 1999.
Wait, what's his name?
Prophet Fred. Sounds like a nice guy. He left the, John Frum group and set up his own different group in a different village on the island of Tana, which explicitly mixes Christianity, custom, in other words, the traditional practices there, and this John Frum cult.
Okay.
So Prophet Fred said that he had a divine vision, basically, while he was working on a boat, on a Korean fishing boat out in the ocean, where he was given a vision by God that he was meant to go back to his native land and start, teaching people the real truth of John Frum and Christianity and custom, that he was given this divine inspiration to go back and become Prophet Fred.
So is it like his own interpretation of it, or it's what he saw in this vision and he's like, oh, here's what's actually going on?
Well, I think this gets to the other mystery in this situation. Do the leaders of these groups truly believe what they're saying?
Right.
Did they truly have a vision and that's why they're doing this? Or is it more cynical than that?
And that's something you could say about anything, anywhere.
Which is also a very salient feature of early Christianity, right? You had different groups. You had the Gnostics, you had the Paulines, and they had different interpretations of Scripture. Some of them claimed to have had divine inspiration. Later on, you have John Smith, who has his own, sort of, I think, cynical ideas of what Christianity should be. But, I think this is going to happen. If you have religion, you're going to have different sects of that religion. The thing which gave Prophet Fred the ability to make these claims credibly to the native people was that he predicted that a certain dam would break within the next year or something, and that did actually happen.
What?
So thousands of people moved away from the place that eventually got flooded and were saved.
That's crazy.
Yeah. Now, again, did he do this because he was given some sort of divine inspiration, or because he had knowledge of engineering, or because he was told that by someone who had knowledge of it?
Like he looked at the cracks and was like, well, blah, 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 blah.
Right. It's a little hard, to know. But so there was religious conflict between these two groups, including what basically amounts to a small religious war in which 25 men were seriously injured. And I believe this was in 2004, if I remember correctly. So, like I said, the relative sincerity of any of these religious leaders involved in the John Frum or other cargo cults is kind of up for debate. But that basic story of this white man who's this messianic figure who will return someday and who they believe actually lives within the volcano that's there on the island of Tana.
Sweet.
And they actually believe that the chief talks to John Frum on a regular basis out in the forest. Sort of similar to John Smith, no one else gets to go. No one else gets to talk to John Frum, but he does, which is nice for him. Yeah. He lets us know what John Frum says. And they actually believe that there is a road that leads from that volcano all the way to the United States. So John Frum travels, and in their conception, John Frum is sort of a spiritual figure, or maybe a figure who can move between the spiritual world and the corporeal world. Very similar to Jesus. And there's some debate as to how much of this is kind of, comes directly from the missionaries and the native peoples kind of taking and using the stories in the Bible and then molding that onto their practices. And John Frum is this very explicitly Jesus-like figure. I mean, they say explicitly, you've been waiting for Jesus for 2,000 years. We've been waiting for John Frum for 70 years. You know, how is that any different?
True.
And
For
it's
real.
hard to argue with that.
Yeah.
It's, you know, but the other interesting aspect of this, I think, is how this whole idea of cargo cultism and this conception of the cargo cult, that it can actually be seen as also a lens through which to understand the Western obsession with material wealth.
Okay.
That it's not that the native peoples, you know, necessarily see it as, you know, we need to get all this stuff that the white people have, and how can we, you know, do that. That it's more that we're putting that on to them, because the only way that we can understand the world is through this material wealth. I sort of disagree with that in a sense, because the local culture does have a very strong focus on material wealth, and the local peoples are, in Tana specifically, kind of awash with their own version of material wealth, which is coconuts and the crops. You know, the soil there is very, very rich because of the volcano. So it's not as if they were poor, you know, necessarily.
I can't stop thinking about Moana
Right.
through this whole thing, like the volcano,
Right.
and the fact that you said it started over near Polynesian cultures where,
Yeah.
and material wealth and that kind of thing.
Right.
And they worship the coconut.
And how do you make sure that you're going to be able to continue to sustain that? You know, to them, the spiritual world and the material world are always together. They're always in a kind of symbiotic relationship with one another. So it makes sense to me that they would have seen the white settlers and colonialists and missionaries in that same vein. It's you know, to me it makes perfect sense from their perspective. And that you know, although we may never know if John Frum was ever real, will he ever come back? Is this a sincere belief by these leaders? I think what I take away from it, and what I kind of find most interesting about it, are those features of the religion that are so similar to religions that we see in the Western world. And it reminds me that any belief that's based on rationality is a belief that should be respected, understood,
For sure.
seen on its own, in its own terms. There's a real tendency, and I saw this in stuff from the 50s and stuff from much more modern day, to look at these people and say, oh, that's so sweet. Oh, they think they're going to get cargo. They don't understand. They're backwards. They're ignorant. They're living in poverty. No, not really. When you really look at it, their lives were pretty great. They had all the food they wanted. They didn't need anything else.
Do they have a book?
There was a bibliography that I read which described a book called Cargo Cults by Lamont Lindstrom, from which I got some of the information. Some other of it was from Scientific American.
So they don't have like a Bible or something?
Oh, I see what you mean. Not that I read about, no. It's basically an oral tradition in that sense. But they do have very specific practices. There's actually a John Frum Day on February 15th of each year.
I think we should celebrate.
Right? And what they do is they actually do a ritual reenactment of army drills, and they have like USA written on their chests, and they have logs that they've, you know, cut down to look like to look like rifles, exactly, and bayonets that they've painted red. So it's all, you know, very interesting. And they wave the American flag. They sing songs.
Is it because John Frum was American?
It was because John Frum was American. I think it was also because they, at least I heard some of the native peoples talking in these terms were treated fundamentally differently by the Americans than by the French and the Japanese that had come before. They said that the Americans treated them basically more as equals, and that they saw the black soldiers that had come with the Americans also basically treated as equals with their white counterparts.
Yeah, that's important.
And that was very important to them, yes. And signaled to them that I think these people have something to give to us, apart from just this sense of, material wealth, just the kind of chocolate and the pipes, etc. But that there's a kind of idea that we can take from them, and John Frum maybe is their kind of embodiment of that idea. He's the perfect American, because not only is he American, but he's also us. And not only is he going to give us stuff, but he's also going to give us our traditions back.
Yeah.
So he's this kind of perfect meld, and the paradoxes that he embodies, they really embrace those. And it's, I think, again, similar to other religions where you have the mystery, and you're supposed to kind of embrace the mystery and the paradox. Was Jesus a man or was Jesus a god? Well, he was both. Was John Frum a spirit or a man?
Jesus was a black woman.
Exactly. And God is Alanis Morissette.
And Beyonce is related to Jesus.
Very interesting.
It's true. It's true.
It's all true.
She has so much power.
Exactly.
She's Beyonce. That was really good. That kind of parallels to that other idea that we were talking about religions and how there's so many, and we could do a podcast just based off of religions. And I would start with my own religion. I am a devout Oreist. I worship the Oreo. Nabisco is my main god. Right. Oreos are a sacred cookie.
You were ingesting of the sacred cookies before we started recording? Yes,
the sacred cookie.
I think you might be able to hear a little bit of chomping on a sacred cookie at the beginning of the podcast.
If you heard that chomping, that means you are devout.
That was sacred chomping.
You've been chosen.
Chosen by the chomping.
Chosen by the Oreo. We don't kill people, though.
Good.
And if you also want to be Christian, that's totally okay.
Great.
So do you want to be an Oreist?
No.
I have a pamphlet.
Than't you, though.
I'm just kidding, I don't have a pamphlet.
Appreciate it.
Okay, so I'm going to be 100% honest with y'all. I forgot that we were going to add a new segment. We're going to add a new segment, which would be the weird news. Mario found a great article, if you're going to do what I think you're going to do. But I totally forgot about it, so I'm going to let you talk. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Okay, I'm going to start.
Okay.
Okay, so I found this really weird article on CBS News, and the headline, I saw the headline and I had to click on it. It says, "Man declared dead, snores to life right before autopsy." And I was like, what the fuck? That is some weird shit. So this was in Spain, and this is an article from January 10th, 2018. So very, very recently it happened, where doctors were basically just about to cut into this guy, 29-year-old Gonzalo Montoya Jimenez. He was a prisoner at a jail in northern Spain, and they basically went to his cell, and he wasn't responsive at all. And he was declared dead by 3 different doctors, right? Now, there's some question as to whether they really looked at him or whether they were just like, yeah, he's dead.
Prisoner.
Whatever.
Yeah.
His family says that he has a history of epilepsy, and there is this thing that happens which is called an epileptic catalepsy, where you can become trance-like and rigid, so it can kind of seem like you're dead, but it's apparently a feature of, or a side effect rather, of epilepsy, of that condition. So they had already marked him for autopsy.
Oh my god.
Which I think is the creepiest part of this whole thing. So they had put the marker on his body, marking where they were just about to cut into him, and then he goes and wakes up.
How did that go?
This is my interpretation of it.
Beautiful.
So think of that when you're going to bed tomorrow. He did not end up dying, so that's good at least. This apparently is not the first time that this has ever happened. I mean, I've heard of this before, but in the article they cite also in 2014, a 91-year-old woman in Poland was declared dead and spent 11 hours in a mortuary before staff discovered her body bag moving. Alive.
No.
And this actually it reminds me of also how they think people, this isn't really the same thing, but they think people started believing in zombies because they heard sounds coming from recently, deceased and buried people.
The gas.
But now they know it's because, they didn't use embalming and the gas expanded and it made those sounds, and that's what they think. So, creepy.
Screw that.
Right.
Wow. Can you? Oh my god.
I cannot.
That's so scary.
Right.
So, good job.
Good job by you, Chloe. Good job by you.
I give up.